The United Nations says it has never been so short on money to help the world's poor, and it desperately needs nearly $5 billion to make up for it. The situation isn't helped by the global financial crisis, which is forcing richer nations to focus on their own problems, while the poor keep getting poorer. Al-Jazeera's Kath Turner reports.
Millions of people around the world rely on the United Nations for the most basic supplies: food, water. But now the chances of them actually receiving the help they desperately need are worse than ever. The UN's half-yearly report on emergency funding has revealed a $4.8 billion funding gap for its aid projects in 2000. The countries suffering the most include Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe and Somalia. So why is the financial situation so dire this year? The biggest factor is the global economic recession, which has seen many donor countries concentrating on financial problems at home rather than abroad. Those donor countries are preparing to set their budgets for 2010. Making matters worse, a huge increase in the number of those in need.
What we're asking for is money for 43 million people this year, as opposed to only 28 million last year, and that's an indication of how the needs have risen, together with new crises and conflicts, for example, in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and of course a continuation of many old ones, Darfur and others in Sudan.
Conflicts in Pakistan and Sri Lanka have left hundreds of thousands of people homeless, while droughts and civil war in African countries have pushed more.
Development aid is very much needed and always has been, but also there's an immediate need now for humanitarian assistance to save lives, simply food and water to keep people alive.
Countries at the G20 summit in April pledged more than $1 trillion towards helping developing nations, and at the G8 summit earlier this month, $20 billion was pledged to increase food supplies to poorer countries. But those verbal promises simply... The United Nations says governments have maintained their pledges for 2009, and at the halfway mark, the UN has received almost half of its funding requirements for the year. But it's still not enough, and the economic crisis is likely to worsen suffering in countries with the least amount of resources to cope. Kath Turner, Al Jazeera, at the United Nations, New York.
For more on this situation, we're joined by Eric Munoz. He is the co-author of the 2009 World Hunger Report, and he represents Bread for the World Institute. Eric Munoz, the UN, we heard in that report, says 50% more people need help today than did in 2008. And that's despite the billions of dollars that are being pledged by developed countries, not necessarily paid, but pledged. Is there a problem with aid? Is aid the solution?
Well, in the short term, to solve the humanitarian problem that we're facing right now, with hundreds of millions of people being pushed into hunger and poverty, we need a major aid push just to address immediate suffering. And then we need to figure out ways in the long term to deal with the structural issues that keep people in poverty.
Do you agree, though, with those economists, and I quote a Zambian economist called Dambisa Moyo, who argues that aid is the main barrier to development, that there needs to be a long-term strategy that doesn't perpetuate African nations and other poor countries' reliance on aid, and with all the strings attached that come along with the aid that is given from developed Western countries?
Well, we definitely need a strategy. I think part of the problem with aid is that it's uncoordinated on the ground. So you have 10 or 20 different aid agencies working in multiple directions on multiple projects without a coordinated approach. So yeah, we need foreign direct investment, which Dambisa Moyo absolutely argues for quite emphatically, but we also need developed countries to provide assistance where it makes sense and can make a difference.
But talking about a long-term solution and strategy, what would that be? Would it be genuine agricultural development to make these countries more self-sufficient? Western aid policy, farm policies have hurt poor countries in many respects because of the subsidies they give to their own farmers that make it very difficult for the developing world to compete and to feed itself.
Right, so we've had a long history of decades worth of ignoring agriculture in developing countries, and we're sowing the legacy of that right now with higher rates of hunger and poverty. So a return to agriculture, a return to investments in rural infrastructure, in the kinds of programs and projects that will make a difference for poor people is absolutely essential. And I think this is a really tremendous moment when we have the world's attention galvanized on just the kinds of investments and attention that's needed to foster long-term sustainable growth.
But how counterproductive would you say aid has been? would you agree with those who say it's had minimal impact on the economies of many countries?
Well, there's a lot of ways to cut it. So you can look at economic growth, for example, and the studies vary on the effectiveness of aid in approaching or in assisting with economic development. But if you look at other things, for example, global health, aid has had a tremendous impact on, for example, ridding the world of smallpox, on lowering child mortality and maternal mortality rates around the world, of putting millions of people on antiretroviral drugs to address HIV/AIDS. So to blanket qualify aid as not helping economic growth really doesn't do justice to the ways in which aid really does help a lot of people.
Is there some hypocrisy, though, attached to the way traditional donors in Western governments have given aid to developing countries, in that they give some money, or at least they pledge some money? And just a few days ago at the G20 summit, $20 billion was pledged, even though at Gleneagles the money that was pledged wasn't paid at all. Yet governments like the United States find billions and billions of dollars of bailout money that they happily and willingly give companies that at best may have mismanaged themselves, and yet they find themselves bailed out for billions of dollars worth.
We have a long way to go in making the commitments that we made turn into actual programs on the ground and get that money dispersed and out the door to governments who can do really fantastic work with it. We can do a lot more and a lot better than we have been doing. It's up to civil society groups, it's up to people in the US who vote for these members of Congress, for example, to knock on their doors, to pick up the phones and ask them to actually live up to the commitments that they've made.
But this isn't disinterested aid. There's a lot of trade-off going on as well.
Certainly in the short term there'll be some trade-offs with the economic crisis, but we can't allow that to interfere with the long-term development strategy.
Eric Munoz, a policy analyst with Bread for the World Institute. Thanks very much for coming in.
Sure, thanks.
Now you can read more on that story on our website at aljazeera.net/English. You can follow the links from the front page to the first of 5 special reports by Al Jazeera's Mohamed Ado on the deadly crisis of hunger in the Horn of Africa.